So this one, okay, so we're going to continue on our thing about gift giving and talking about the gifts that were being given at Christmas time. I say Christmas time because, as we talked about last week, they kind of showed up a little bit late as they had already moved into the house. But nonetheless, I think arriving with the gifts that they did and in the condition that they did, which was, of course, a condition of ready worship, right? As we read last week in the was it Matthew? Yes, Matthew chapter 2. They immediately, as soon as they see the child, immediately recognize him, fall down, and they worship him, even before they give the gifts or do anything else. And so last week we talked about the gift of gold and what a kingly gift that would have been, and how gold had been representative, especially back then. I feel like it's less so today. More so if you see someone wearing a lot of gold today, you're like, wow, it's really gaudy and gross, and people don't like it as much anymore. But back then, it was a real sign of, power and influence, and of course, it had a huge sign of status. And today, I want to talk about myrrh. Myrrh is, of course, the last gift reference, but it's the one I want to talk about second, because myrrh is actually, as I've discovered, incredibly interesting. I didn't realize, first off, how much stuff it's still in today. And there's actually, just as a complete aside, myrrh is actually currently being studied for medicinal properties as well, which I thought was crazy. I didn't realize how, but throughout basically all of human civilization, as far back as we can look, myrrh has been incredibly useful and has been used for a number of applications. Myrrh was, of all of the gifts that he gives, of gold, frankincense, and myrrh was definitely the most common, but by no means did its commonality mean that it was not valuable. Myrrh was incredibly valuable because of its numerous applications. Myrrh had often been traded for not only its scent, but also medicinal and spiritual qualities that you found. And if you're wondering, by the way, what myrrh is an extract from a plant that it doesn't look nice, but it smells quite nice. If you ever have a chance to get some, you can usually, especially around Christmas time, it becomes widely available, and you can get like little cylinders of myrrh, and you can smell them, and they actually are really, really nice. And myrrh that's actually been one of the primary features that we read about in the Bible about the use of myrrh was the fact it had such a nice scent. In fact, the first reference I want to look at today is found in Esther, the book of Esther, chapter 2, verses 12. So this is after Esther has been selected to become one of the women to not necessarily be the wife of the king, but been selected as one of the most beautiful and to be presented for a possible selection. And it said in Esther chapter 2 that during the year before each young woman's turn to go to king, that guy, the harem's regulation required her to receive beauty treatments with oil of myrrh for 6 months, and then with perfumes and cosmetics for another 6 months. So so they had a full year of beauty treatments. I can't imagine what that would, I know what it costs for me to pay for like an hour at the spa for Rebecca, a full year at the spa. I'm not sure how much they enjoyed it, because I imagine that would get a little bit dull after a while, but still, this was obviously something that was being done because most as you know, most people didn't exist in high society. Most people existed basically in squalor for most of human existence. In fact, the fact that we get to live at now is probably one of our greatest blessings of how the Lord has really brought so many people up out of poverty. And in the book of Esther, here we're reading about her being prepared by having this essentially myrrh coated on her for 6 months. And why was it that they did that? Because myrrh, as I described before, was a perfume. It was meant to smell really good, and it was something that has been widely accepted as smells really good to not just a select group of people, but generally by everyone. And why do I say that? Because when we read in, for example, I skipped right over something. Myrrh is actually a form of incense, and we're familiar with what incense is used for. And this is also part of why it has spiritual application as well. And And the plants that are found for extracting myrrh are found natively in northern Africa and in Arabia, so right kind of where Israel is. So this is actually a prime area for where myrrh was grown and extracted. And then from there, because it was one of the trade corridors of the world, it spread out and it was traded all across the world. So this was a highly sought after commodity, even though it was so widely produced in the area. But because it can only be grown in this area, and it could obviously today we have better farming technology, but back then they could only grow it there, and so it made this particular extract, this myrrh, incredibly valuable. So yes, it was abundance in the area of Israel, but it was, of course, highly valued throughout all of Rome, and in this time throughout all of Persia as well, and as well as Egypt and many other parts of the world. But then, to continue what I was saying about it being good, it being something that everyone liked, we read in Proverbs chapter 7. We actually read this passage the other day, Proverbs chapter 7, verse 17, and it says this. So if you remember, Proverbs chapter 7 is about a woman trying to seduce a young man, and the young man being described as the foolish young man because he falls for her seduction. And at the end of the passage it says, he has been snared, he has been caught, and now he is going to be doomed because of him falling for us. But one of the lures that she uses is this, that she's perfumed. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Right? These were, we're familiar with aloe if you've ever had sunburn, and we're familiar with cinnamon because cinnamon is great. But myrrh is something that's obviously less familiar to us here in Canada because if you didn't know, we're a long ways away from Israel and Arabia and northern Africa. So this is not something that is commonly found in our shops, and it's not something that we commonly use here in Canada today. But it would have, in fact, been one of the perfumes, and it was one of the perfumes of choice because of its accessibility and its fragrance. Its fragrance was so good that in this particular passage, it describes it as one of the lures that actually brings the young man in. It is so enticing and enchanting that it, in fact, brings him in. And it wasn't just the women of lust, shall we say, that use this particular incense, but also we read in Exodus chapter 30, an even more ancient time, as we go back in time even further. As you remember from last week, we talked about this was when they were describing what was going on with the temple and how this would work. In Exodus 30, starting at verse 23, we read about the spiritual qualities of myrrh as well. It said, take for yourselves the finest spices, 12.5 pounds of liquid myrrh, right? Because remember, it's almost kind of, it is a liquid, but it's kind of sappy almost, but it smells really nice. Half of much, 6.25 pounds of fragrant cinnamon, 6.25 pounds of fragrant cane, 12.5 pounds of cassia by the sanctuary shekel, and 1 gallon of olive oil. And it says, prepare from these a holy anointing oil and a scented blend, the work of a perfumer, and it will be holy anointing oil. Right, so it was a main ingredient in the anointing oil. And with it, you are to anoint what? Not just people, right? Oftentimes when we think of anointing oil, we think of when people, they put the oil on their finger and they do a little cross on someone's head or something like that. But no, with this anointing oil, it says you are to anoint the tent of meeting, the ark of the testimony, the table with all of its utensils, and the lampstand with all of its utensils, and the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offerings, and all of its utensils, and the basin with its stand. Consecrate them, and they will be especially holy. Whatever touches them will be consecrated. So this holy anointing oil, if you were paying attention, these sounded like quite large quantities, and it's because they needed a lot of it, because they were going to cover essentially everything in the temple with this holy oil that was being made, with one of course, the key ingredients being myrrh. This was something that God saw, and it actually becomes a practice later on, but it was definitely something that God saw as good, right? God God often has created things, and he describes them as good. And sometimes we don't think of it because we're like, oh yeah, but we did the extract. And it's like, yeah, but God created the plants, and God created the things that are inside the plants, and he did all these things. And he created it for us to be able to use. In fact, he sees that we have the ability to use it, and then requires it as part of this holy anointing oil. Much like how gold is just another thing that God created, he still saw the significance, and as I said last week, the power of its symbol, and uses that to show the significance of this particular gift as well. Finally, myrrh also had another purpose, and it's most often referred to when we're talking about these three gifts. Myrrh, as I mentioned before, also became a part of another Jewish custom, which was the embalming process. Now, if you've ever heard people talk about the three gifts before, oftentimes you do a very condensed sermon where you talk about gold is a kingly gift. Myrrh was the gift of to represent his death, and frankincense his holiness. Well, myrrh was in fact used in the embalming process, and we read about this in John chapter 19, verses 39 to 40, where it says, Nicodemus, who had previously come to him at night, also came. He brought a mixture of about 75 pounds of, that's a lot, of myrrh and aloes. And then they took Jesus' body, wrapped it in linen cloths with the aromatic spices, according to the burial custom of the Jews. I just noticed, I picked a different Bible translation, and that's why I was like, why are things going weird? But it says HCSB there at the bottom. I was like, why is it different than my notes? Now I know why. See, this custom actually predated the time of Jesus by a significant amount, right? It said it was according to the custom of the Jews. This is something that has been going on for quite some time. And it kind of has two reasons. First off, when someone dies, today we have great technology that allows them to, not to put it frankly, not quite start rotting right away. And so they don't smell so bad. But in the days then, when someone died, you didn't really have any way to preserve the body. There was no way to keep them around. And so when you're doing the customary practices, things can smell awful bad. And so you want something that smells nice, right? And so myrrh actually has quite a strong scent, and would actually be used, as you can read here, in significant quantities in order to hide that particular smell. Myrrh was used in this process quite significantly. And the Jews weren't the only people to do this. Ancient Egyptians also used to use myrrh in their embalming process and in their process of mummification as well. They would use liquid myrrh as part of that process as well, because as I said before, they didn't have chemicals and stuff like that. And so they used these perfumes as part of their burial customs. And so myrrh has often, very much today, been assigned to this idea of death. But I actually think it's actually quite intriguing about how the Bible uses this particular thing in so many ways. Right? A lot can be gleaned from this gift from the Magi. Right? And I think it's important because so many times we often just reduce it to this one little fact. We say, yes, it represented death, but I think it represents so much more. We have to look at the entire Bible when we want to see how something is being referred to. If we want to see how these Jews would have understood it, how Jesus and how Mary and Joseph would have received this gift, and how it was meant to be received, it's important that we understand the history of how it was being viewed throughout the time of the Hebrews, and that we understand just exactly what this gift meant. That this was, in fact, a good gift. It was a pleasant gift. This was a really nice gift. Myrrh was something that was highly sought after, very, very much in demand, and traded in great quantities. It was an ideal gift for pretty well any occasion, especially if you were going to go meet a king. You would definitely think to include some measure of liquid myrrh in your gift for a king. But of course, the anointing qualities should not be overlooked either. The spiritual qualities of this gift should not be passed over so quickly. I think sometimes we often do. We forget that this actually had a gift. This actually had a place in consecrating things to the Lord. It made them holy and set them apart for worship to God. Now, of course, I don't want to make that say that the final use that we talked about, to prepare a body, means that this gift isn't somewhat prophetic. I think there is definitely something to that as well, that this was a major part of their custom, that it was used for preparing bodies, and it was something that could be used in this way. But I think it's also important for us not to recognize that it had a wide use. And I think it's also important to recognize that these strangers who came, who recognized the God child at first glance, would have known exactly what this gift was going to be used for, exactly what this gift meant. And they gave it with real intention. Once again, these magi, they knew how to give good gifts. Because once again, they considered that this was a complex gift to give. It had a lot of meaning, it had a lot of use, it had a lot of utility. But they understood that that's because the king that was sitting before them, laying before them, was in fact a complex king. Someone who was going to do some pretty incredible things, who's going to perform miracles and lead people in a very unique and different way than we had ever experienced and probably ever will experience ever again. They understood the arrival of this child meant the beginning of something new, but also the death to something that had been. And I think that will definitely tie in with the last gift, frankincense, which we will get to next week. And I think that is why, I'm going to leave it there.